And I think we are good to go. Thank you everyone for joining me, and welcome to the Healing Our Children 2018 World Summit. I'm Alison Morris, your host, and I am so happy to have with me today Dr. Melanie Salmon, who is coming to us from South Africa. And today we're going to be talking about TRE, or Tension and Trauma Release Exercise, which I have been just fascinated to learn more about. It's a modality I have heard about for years, but never fully investigated myself. So I'm thrilled to bring this all to you, and I'm thrilled to have Dr. Melanie with us today. I think I'm not even going to give too much of a background, because I'd love for you to just tell us a little bit about your journey in getting, in looking for and then finding something like TRE, and then where this has taken you, because it's a fascinating story.
All right, thank you so much. Well, I'm very honored to be on this program, and thank you for inviting me. I feel really rather thrilled to have a word about TRE going a little bit beyond the borders of South Africa. I've been mostly running out TRE in this country, although in about mid-year I will be moving to Europe. But yes, how did I get involved with TRE? Well, I am a medical doctor, I'm a family practitioner, and about 10 years ago I was becoming extremely frustrated with my role as GP in being able to only offer prescriptions and also to offer talk therapies. I was also a Gestalt talk therapist. And both of those didn't seem to meet the need of stressed clients and traumatized clients, especially children. So I really had to search outside of general practice, outside of mainstream. And it was during an internet search that I found Dr. Bercelli, David Bercelli, who's the founder of TRE. And I watched him on an interview. It was just one of those really amazing things. I was looking for something that could take stress out of the body, that would accompany the other work that I do, which is a mind process. And I saw this interview and I was blown away. I knew straight away that I found the right thing. And he talked about the stress release, the ability to shake and get the tension out of your body that he had developed while he had been in the Middle East for 8 years. So that was the very beginning, and the training hadn't been developed then for people to learn it, but he came to England where I was living, and I organized a small group of people, and he came and taught us. And during those 4 days of learning how to shake the stress off my body, I sat up after one of the sessions, and I just knew this really was the way that we can easily, quickly, and effortlessly and safely rid ourselves of the immense tension that we carry. So I invited him to come to South Africa on my return after that, which was 10 years ago. And the rest is history. I've spread TRE around South Africa to thousands of people now are trained as practitioners. And I would say that TRE has reached into traumatized and stressed communities, probably in the region of thousands and thousands of people throughout this country. So that's sort of in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating story. And what I find so interesting is that while you were serving as a GP, you were looking at people's, mostly at their physical health. And then I assume you took on psychotherapy training once you realized that what was in the body has a lot to do with going on with our emotions and our mind. And then sort of came full circle again to realize that even that's not sufficient if there isn't some sort of somatic kind of practice that will, that because talking things through doesn't necessarily release what we've stored up in our cells and our, wherever it ends up in our bodies once we've taken on stress. Yes. And so I find that such a fascinating thing. So this business of shaking, I think we've all seen explanations about fight, flight, freeze, and you know the standard story of watching the lion or the cheetah maybe stalk the gazelle or the antelope in Africa, and and most of the herd gets away, and then the ones that survive stand around and they tremor, they shake, they tremble to release all that pent up energy that their body had geared up for in order to escape the life-threatening danger. And of course, the concept being that as mammals, we also have a similar mechanism when we get stressed, when our brains believe that we're in a life-threatening situation, which may or may not be true, but if the perception is there, our bodies then go into that mode. And yet we have come to believe, for whatever reason over the years, that sort of shaking should be stopped and prevented, and that's not a good thing for us, which is absolutely the opposite of what in fact is true. So what can you explain a little bit about how Dr. Bercelli came upon this realization, and really what's involved in TRE? How does it work?
All right. Well, first of all, how he came upon it was he tells the story himself, which is rather a lovely story. He was stationed there as a Catholic missionary in Lebanon for 8 years, I think it was, during the war. And he didn't have anything to help hundreds of thousands of traumatized, displaced people. He didn't know their language. He didn't know their culture. He only had a sort of talk therapy, and he knew a little bit of body-based therapy, but he didn't really have anything to help. So in the frustration, he spent a lot of time observing how the human body defended itself when the bombs were going off. And what he noticed was common to everybody, men, women, different cultures, and children, was that everybody, when a bomb went off or the roof was hit with a shell or mortar, everybody crouched into a fetal position of protection. So he realized it was an instinctual response. And then the most interesting thing of all, where he really had an aha moment, on one of these occasions they were in a bunker and all of the adults had children on their knees, including him. They were holding the children. And the children were tremoring. The children were shaking like leaves on the knees of the adults. But the adults were absolutely calm and self-possessed. And afterwards, he spoke to one of the adults and he said, I see the children are shaking, but the adults are not. What's happening there? And the man said, we can't let the children see we are afraid. And he made that connection that we do something as adults to switch this off, because we've defined that as a weakness or a pathology. And in fact, in Western medicine and Western psychology, if you look at the DSM-4, or DSM-5 nowadays, which is our Bible of psychotherapy and psychiatry, shaking is defined as a pathology. So if you report shaking, you get diagnosed with some kind of anxiety disorder and put on meds for that. So it has been pathologized. It's been defined inaccurately.
When in fact it's a completely natural and in fact healthy response.
It's the response we needed all along. So what happens in animals, if they take blood tests on an animal that has escaped a threat, such as a chase by a lion, the animal will shake for a full 2 hours. And then they do adrenaline levels, and there's absolutely no adrenaline. There are no toxic chemicals at all. So the animals are able to recalibrate their nervous system back to zero, shake off all the attendant stress chemicals immediately after the event. And that's why in the wild we don't have pathology. Those animals
there aren't antelopes with PTSD or
no, absolutely. You would think there would be. I mean, when you've just been chased by a lion, surely you'd be looking over your shoulder again. But they don't. They go on eating grass like nothing's happened.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And so what did he do similar tests then with humans who had been subjected to
what he
trauma?
Did was he came back. He left the missionary services and came back to the States to study what happens in humans. And so he did his PhD on the shaking mechanism. he found there was very little literature. Nobody had done any studies on this mechanism. I mean, this is quite a long time ago. I think this was about 15, 20 years ago now. I think there's been a lot subsequently done. And basically, I mean, what happens in humans is exactly the same mechanism. The only thing is we don't allow ourselves to shake fully to shake off something that happens in an acute shock. And if we did, we would probably need to shake for about 2 hours. We shake for a few minutes, but then somebody will come along, you know, the paramedics will come up and put a blanket over you and give you a cup of tea because they say, oh dear, you're in shock, we've got to stop this. And if you don't stop shaking, they'll take you to casualty and give you an injection to stop it. I've done it myself. I used to be a casualty doctor, you see. So we use medication to stop, to break the, to break that response and to damp it down. And so culturally, we've switched that off as adults.
Is the physiological response similar in what we might consider chronic stress or sort of with low T traumas? So things like neglect or abuse or abandonment or gosh, bullying or things like that that aren't acute sort of big T traumas like surviving a bombing or a car accident or some natural disaster.
For me, there isn't terribly much difference in the nervous system, in the autonomic nervous system. The part of the nervous system we're referring to here that automatically responds to danger or threat is the autonomic nervous system. And it has the fight or flight or freeze response, depending on how severe the shock is. But if you have a lot of small chronic threats, small punishments in childhood, say, your needs are not being met, there's neglect, there's poverty, all of those things. All of those add up. They don't put you immediately into fight and flight, but they're cumulative over time. So over time, the nervous system does become frozen or stuck, as if it had had one big trauma. So it's the same thing in the end. The result is the same.
And do you know, has there been, I think there have been studies, but I wasn't sure if Dr. Bercelli had done some of this to then measure the adrenaline or cortisol levels in humans to see whether that is also elevated in the aftermath of these?
Dr. Bercelli is now doing studies with the US military. And I think that does include, that will include these blood tests and parameters that can prove beyond any doubt that before and after the shaking mechanism, there's a significant change in the toxic chemicals. But no, he chose not to go the path of research when he began. And I think the reason was that he was so moved by the enormity of suffering out there and went immediately into actually working with people around the globe. And he's only back in the States, I would say, the last 3 or 4 years. Prior to that, he was traveling around the world, and he came to South Africa for 2 years, traveling around the world to wherever he was invited where there was a lot of trauma. And he just went straight in to deliver the TRE exercises. The reason why they work so well in major traumas all over the globe, and he's been everywhere with this, is that they can be delivered in large numbers, in large groups, in a short time frame, without the use of language, without knowing the culture, which was one of his original challenges. You don't have to speak to somebody to be able to give them this exercise. And then you sit and support them in silence, and it works exactly the same. So that was the thing he realized, was this had a particular reach for people who were displaced, who had no money. They were displaced in large numbers, and he could reach them in large numbers and provide some form of relief. So that was his objective. It's only now, I'd say, in the last 3 to 4 years that he's now resident back in the States and now doing research work and finding the funding for that. That was also a problem.
Sure. Yes, expensive. So can you tell us then a little bit about how this works and what the process is and how long it takes, all the sort of details here?
All right. So basically, it's a very simple set of exercises that that David developed, which is used by adults or children. Children from the age of 6 or 7 can do it. Under that, they don't need to because they shake naturally. They seem to switch off that mechanism at about 7. So it's a set of 6 exercises that are very easy to do, and you end up lying on a mat, on a yoga mat on the ground after a 15-minute process, and the exercises switch on the shaking mechanism in a muscle that's deep in the pelvis, the one that holds that tension. So there's a muscle called the psoas muscle. It's spelled P-S-O-A-S, the psoas muscle. It's deep in the pelvis, and it attaches to our lower back and to our femur, to our thigh bone. And that's the one that makes us curl up like that when we're threatened. Okay, so that's the muscle that stays tight. And that muscle is designed to shake. So doing this exercise routine, once you're lying on the mat, your legs start to shake, just like this, just a nice vibration. It's comfortable and it's pleasant for most parts. And you lie there for 20 minutes, that's a routine, passively while your legs are shaking and that muscle is releasing. And while it's tremoring like this, and you've seen animals who tremor, you know, when you take your dog to the vet, its back legs will be tremoring like that. They'll go into a vibration. That's what we do with this exercise. And at the end of that 20 minutes, what's happened to that muscle is it's become deeply relaxed and it's lengthened. Because in the stress state, it's contracted tight. It's like a tight muscle. And when it's lengthened out like that, it sends a message to the brain. This is the important part. This is how it works. The relaxed psoas sends a message to the brain that danger is over, because it won't relax until the danger is over. Okay. And it can only relax if it tremors.
And is that connection to the brain, that's via the polyvagal nerve then? Or how does that work?
The polyvagal nerve is somewhere in that, but it's not directly that. There are receptors that go from the tendons in the muscle itself that is a feedback loop to the brain stem. But the importance of the feedback message to the brain to say that danger is over, if that muscle remains tight and tense, the message to the brain from the tension in that muscle is that danger is ever present. So the brain keeps sending out adrenaline. It's only small amounts, but it keeps sending it out. And so it keeps you on a constant state of anxiety and high alert. And it's only when you break that cycle with a tremor and the muscle is able to lengthen itself that everything suddenly stops. You see how important that is.
And what is the mental or emotional process that is going on while the body is doing the shaking?
The odd thing
are people quiet and just noticing? Or is there any danger of reliving the trauma that caused the tightening in the first place? Or is this safe in that respect, that there's no sort of harm or potential harm of re-traumatizing someone?
It's there's no real danger of re-traumatizing somebody with TRE. There's only one caveat, and that is that in the first 6 weeks or so, TRE should be delivered in the safe care and safe hands of a TRE provider who knows how to help you regulate, because you don't want to let all of your adrenaline and tension out in one volcanic outburst in the first session. That might be unpleasant. It's never dangerous. TRE's never killed anyone. And we can't say that about medicine. But having said that, it's unpleasant. And so what the TRE provider will do, and this is especially important for children, the amount of trauma you've had and the nature of your trauma will be fully evaluated and where you are with that. And then you will be taught how to self-regulate so that you're only letting a little bit out at a time. And then if anything is rising and coming up and feeling a bit too overwhelming in terms of tension release, then you just straighten your legs out and the process stops. You're in control of it all the time. In terms of remembering the trauma, that's actually quite rare. You know, I've been training people to do this for 10 years, and I'm probably trained a few thousand by now. I'd say maybe 10% of people will sometimes have a memory of a trauma, but it's usually in a detached way. It's not about going back into the trauma in the way we used to do in psychotherapy, where you would get people to cathart and go all the way back in and relive it. It's not like that at all. It's the body doing a simple release that's actually a little detached from your mind. And a lot of people will watch the TV while they're doing it, or they'll have a chat to their friend, or they'll get on the phone. So you can be in a different space with your neocortex while your body is releasing.
Okay, that's very helpful to know, because I think that's always a concern for folks about whether that might, come up. So if my understanding is correct, the training that is currently available is really focused on adults, correct? And not training for children, but you have come up with a specific approach to working with children. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how you came to develop that?
All right. Yes, you're right. The ordinary TRE provider training is for adults. And in South Africa, I found myself in a situation starting 5 years back where I was invited into children's homes and institutions where the level of trauma of both the staff, you know, the caregivers in the institution and the hundreds of children in them was so extreme that they were basically desperate, and they'd heard about TRE. And so I think this is the kind of thing that happens when you're in a third world country and you see things in such numbers and such severity. You know, you go ahead and give it a try. So I hadn't done any work with children, but I was willing to at least work with these 120 children from this children's village. But I chose to work with the caregivers first, the mothers and the aunties who look after the children in little family groups. And the astonishing thing that I found was that by the mothers themselves doing the TRE first, when their nervous system calmed down because they were very stressed, suddenly they were reporting less problems with the children's behavior. So already there was a distinct improvement by improving the caregivers. And that actually gave me the clue about the way we need to approach working with children. We have to get the parents involved, or those who are caring for the child, to have the de-stressing program on themselves first. And then we worked with the children after that for a period of 8 weeks, and I uncovered a lot of truths from doing this, and I made some mistakes, but on the whole we were highly successful. And what I discovered was that children, first of all, love TRE. Secondly, you don't have to do the full exercise routine. You can be creative and create all kinds of games in which you can tire out the leg muscles, which is what you have to do to get the shaking. You've got to tire out the leg muscles. And so each little house had their own games or their own routine. Mm-hmm. But by and large, the people that I trained just offer the simple routine to the children, and they like it. So that bit of research, together with subsequent research, which I did for 3 years running, I probably researched about 300 children with TRE now, with excellent results. And what I've discovered is that TRE is very different with children. You can't take them through the same routine as you do with an adult. They have a different response. Their nervous system is much quicker to respond, and it's much quicker to heal. So it's a much shorter journey. It's delivered over a much shorter time. They have fewer side effects or fewer bad reactions, as you can sometimes get in an adult with too much of an explosive discharge. A child doesn't seem to go there. So there are all kinds of differences. So I gathered all this information from my observations over the years and put it into a program where I now teach over 3 days. I teach the developmental trauma so people can understand how at different developmental ages children are developmentally damaged and in what way, and then how you can apply the TRE specifically to that developmental need and requirement in order for it to heal. So it's not just a matter of taking children in large groups and getting them to shake. You can't do that. Children won't. You can't just, do what you do with adults. It is a much more careful, programmed, relational approach tailored to the child's needs. So I always advocate one-on-one with children. I don't like them going into groups. They're not cared for sufficiently that way, you know. So there are a lot of differences, but it came out of the need. The need in the country was so high that I just went and did it.
So I want to hear a whole lot more about what was going on with the kids and sort of what you noticed or what their caregivers noticed before and after. But when you're working with adults, what is the traditional kind of protocol for how long you have to do this, for how many weeks? Does it stick then forever, or is this something you have to come back to for sort of maintenance on a regular basis, or how does that work?
All right. Well, the whole purpose of TRE is to recalibrate the autonomic nervous system back to what we call in the parlance baseline, which is a state of calm relaxation where you feel deeply connected to yourself.
Okay.
That's baseline. Now, most of us have a nervous system that's not sitting there, not unless we've done a lot of work on ourselves or a lot of somatic work or meditation or whatever. So the TRE process to get to baseline from wherever you are takes about 3 months of regular TRE, probably about 40 TRE sessions of 20 minutes each. So it's on average 3 times a week for 20 minutes. It's most effective when it's done with a facilitator, with somebody holding the space for you. I know that geographically not everybody can get hold of a facilitator, and you can do it from a DVD or a book, but it's not quite the same. And the reason why I've observed a big difference between the two, I think that when we're traumatized in isolation. We don't have somebody there holding the space for us when we're traumatized. So when we're healing from trauma, we need that emotional support. We need
that
somebody holding the space.
Yeah, okay.
So we get much better results. And so when I'm teaching people to be TRE providers, I teach them to try and hold the space for somebody for about 6 weeks. So that would be my recommendation. So that's adults. And then once you get to baseline, now it all depends on what your lifestyle is and what stresses you have. If you have a very stressful job, you may notice your body will let you know. Your body informs you when you need to tremor. And you may have to continue to tremor 3 times a week during a job like that. If you have a job like mine, I live in the country. There's no noise. I don't travel to work. You know, I work from home. I love what I do. I'm very relaxed. I probably tremor once a month now. You know, I don't need much. So your body informs you what you need. There is a maintenance to it, but it's dependent on the individual.
So is this the sort of thing, now when you say 20 minutes, that's the shaking, but there's also the lead in, so the muscle fatigue portion. Does your body learn? Is the shaking a learned response so that you don't need to do as much of the fatiguing so that you can just turn it on later with less effort?
I find it takes about 3 weeks and then you don't need the exercise as much anymore. It's
okay.
A nice routine and a lot of people like to do it. But after about 3 weeks, most people, and certainly children, can just go straight to the floor, to the mat, and then
okay. I ask because, of course, everybody's always worried about the time commitment and where will I find the time, and I don't have enough time to exercise anyway. How will I add this onto it? All that sort of thing. So,
and another lovely thing is that if you are somebody who does regular exercise, you can tag the tremor part of the exercise onto your exercise program. So if you go for a run in the morning for an hour, come home, lie on the mat, and tremor at the end of that, because your legs are already tired. So
already
yes,
fatigued.
That part.
Okay. So back to the Children's Village. What sorts of behaviors were the caregivers reporting to you? And I have a guess, but just to give us a sense of what they were dealing with. Excuse me, I'm going to cough here. I'll take a sip.
Well, I worked first of all with the Children's Village, and then I worked with a school that was over a 2-year period. also serving a very similar population. It was a school on the Cape Flats. I don't know if you know about the townships in South Africa and the problems there. It's a little bit like the refugee camps in Europe. It's a war zone. And children who live in these townships have to put up with constant danger, gunfights and stuff going off all the time, and a lot of drug addiction and so on. So there aren't parents at home. These children have to get themselves to school and so on. So it's a very similar population group. And in both groups, the children's village and in the school, the basic complaint, well, there were so many. The first one is that the children had a high level of anxiety, and what we would term, were diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity disorder, were disruptive at school, couldn't focus, couldn't concentrate, were having a lot of learning problems. So that's the first part. The nervous system was definitely supercharged. Secondly, there was a lot of violence, aggressive outbursts, which goes with that supercharge, because children weren't able to control their aggression. Thirdly, the other part of the autonomic nervous system that's affected with trauma and stress in children is bedwetting. So a high percentage of them were bedwetters at the age of 7, 8, 9, 10, were bedwetting almost every day. And in the village, of course, this was a great problem for the mums who had to, deal with that.
Sure.
And yeah, just taking those problems alone, not sleeping well, a lot of children were having nightmares at night. Children who live in the townships and who live in areas of political war and, these camps. There was a study done by the American Pediatric Journal in 2013, and what they found is that almost 100% of those children have got PTSD. So that's the same as in our South African townships. Almost 100% of these kiddies have got symptoms of PTSD. So they're hypervigilant, they're very, very anxious, they have nightmares, they can't sleep at night, they have bedwetting. So these were all the symptoms. And I was invited in to do TRE with this lot, and I just thought, I've got no idea whether it's going to help or not. But they were desperate, and I was willing. So the results were quite astonishing, because every single one of those parameters, not only did some of them disappear completely, what disappeared 100% in every child, in all 300 that I saw, was bedwetting. Not a single child was bedwetting by the end of 8 weeks, and that was sustained. They all had improvements in their levels of anxiety. They all calmed down. Their focus and concentration came back. There were no more complaints from the school. The mothers weren't invited to the school. From the teachers complaining, that disappeared. Their behavior changed. They were reported to be much more manageable, easygoing. So the whole nervous system calmed down, and it was clear that those what had previously been diagnosed as attention deficit disorder and so on, were all just part of the autonomic nervous system being out of regulation, because it all disappeared without medication. These kiddies weren't on medication. There's no medication for them. They can't afford it. They don't see doctors. But they were still, diagnosed with these problems by the teachers. So, incredible results.
Which is so fascinating, because, so many of our audience, and I would put myself in this boat, we're so rarely trying anything in isolation, right? We're in many cases desperate to get changes in regulation in our kids, and so we've added supplements. They might be on meds. We're trying maybe 2 or 3 different therapies at the same time, and then it's hard to know. Maybe we've changed their diet. We've got all these things going at the same time often, because we don't want to wait, and we're not running a double-blind clinical trial, right? We just want our kids to get better. Yet here you had a situation where none of those other interventions were even possible, and so it was quite clear what the change was due to, what the underlying cause of their improvements was, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Oh, I'm just curious. You said earlier that you first trained the caregivers, and
Yes.
already that produced an improvement in the children's anxiety. Um, how much did that help just on its own before the kids were treated at all?
Do you know the caregivers did TRE for 10 weeks? And they were so stressed in that first meeting with them. That's where I had the clue that I had to work with them first. Because actually, the invitation was for me to just work with the children.
Interesting.
But
Okay.
there was such a high rate of staff turnover that when I met with them and I asked them what the problem was, they were crying. They were standing up and saying, it's the traumatized helping the traumatized. We need help. We are so exhausted. We're so stressed. We can't sleep. This. They had so many things themselves because, of course, they also live in these townships. A lot of them had to go home at night to the gunfire and so on. And I thought, I have to work with them first. So I worked with a group of very traumatized middle-aged people. These are not young, healthy people. These are overweight, most of them mamas, sort of in their mid-50s, huge women. To do TRE with them, it wasn't easy. In 10 weeks, it was completely different in the village. When you arrived there, you couldn't believe this. It was the same place. It was happy, calm, relaxed. They were playing with the children. The irritation had gone. The entire interaction had changed. And when I asked them how much better are the children, they said a lot better. I wasn't measuring at the time, but I mean, it was obvious that it's key that you have to work with the caregiver first. It's key because if you don't, what are you going to do with the child? If you only work with a child, let's say you decide to take TRE into a school, and the children will get better very quickly, 4 to 6 weeks, and their nervous system's back to zero, back to normal. They have to go back to that toxic environment. They need their nervous system to be defensive in order to protect themselves. So it would be counterproductive to only work with a child. You see where I'm coming from with it? So I won't advocate, if a parent is not willing to do it, I won't give a child TRE.
I'm struggling with that a little, I think, because I know so many parents who feel as though they weren't stressed until their children's behavior emerged. And their children's behavior was not necessarily due to abuse or neglect on the part of the parent, although that's true in certainly some circumstances. But it's due to in utero stress or adoption, attachment relationship issues, or toxic environmental things that have accumulated that have sort of just finally, they're too much for their bodies to handle. Yeah. And at the same time, I've interviewed, I don't know how many people where we've chatted about the interconnection between the energies and the stress levels of parents and children, and how, when the parent takes care of themselves first, it has to have an effect on the child and makes things better. But I wonder, though, if it wouldn't be helpful in certain circumstances to work with the children, even if you can't reach the parents, on the theory that then the parents automatically would start to de-stress once their children's symptoms had started to decrease. I don't know how you feel about that.
I guess we're talking from two different countries. You're in a first world country, and
yeah.
And so the level of trauma and stress here is endemic, and it's beyond anything you can imagine.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I suppose the advice I give to people here is based on that.
Sure.
When a child is going back to a toxic environment, we're talking about almost a war zone. So yes, in a first world, you would take each case on its own merit. There are going to be times where a child itself is in need of some de-stressing technique, and the parent is not stressed. The parent is basically stable, grounded, and so on, and doesn't need to do it as well. But I think in any event, it's a very bonding thing for a family If a
Sure.
mother and child can do it together, it helps the child to keep up with the exercises and so on. So it's both bonding and it's supportive. So if you can talk the mother into doing it as well, I think it's rather lovely.
Oh, sure. And I certainly would, I would absolutely concede that I would say 100% of cases, the parents would benefit from it as well. I think I was merely wondering whether there still might be benefit to helping children, even if you could not reach the parents, simply because even if it improved their performance at school, without even improving their behavior at home, that would still be a win. But tell us more about how it differs when you're working with children. Now, I assume in the case of the children's villages, you were not working individually. You were working with groups of children. But you then, through that, noticed that there were significant enough differences in their response and in the trauma that they'd been through that you realized you need, right, ideally, it would be a one-on-one sort of situation where you could assess their needs and their background.
The Children's Village was the first project that I did with 123 children. And each group was a family group of 8 to 10 children with two adults living in the house. And it was a safe group. They knew each other. And the age range within each group of 10 children was from 4 to 18. So the only feasible way to do it was to do it as a family group. And I think the reason why it probably worked, and it worked just fine, was that it was a family group and there wasn't this issue of needing to develop trust and safety. They already felt safe. They were in their own home with their own mum and their auntie and with their brothers and sisters that they'd known for a long, long time. And so lying on the floor, doing an exercise or anything wasn't something that was going to provoke shame and all sorts of other issues that we have if we try and put children in groups. So after that, though, I still felt that the children didn't have enough one-on-one holding space. And so the next batch of work that I did, the research was with about 200 children from this primary school. And we used the teacher who had trained with me. She was the deputy head of the primary school from this area, the Cape Flats I was telling you about. And she took all the referrals from the rest of the school of children that were disruptive, who were doing badly in class, children who were bedwetting or had behavior problems, and so on. And she also collaborated with parents at home. So we had a full collaboration. We had the teacher on board, the parents on board. We filled in all the medical indemnity forms and so on. And then she saw them one-on-one. And that's when we really started to monitor and see how long does this take and what is involved. And so we found that on average, it took about 6 weeks for a child to reach normal levels, only seen once a week. So you're talking about six TRE sessions as opposed to adults who need 40. Okay. So that was the difference. It's a very, very big difference. But yeah, and all of the same problems disappeared. The bedwetting went, the concentration problems, all of that. We documented all of that.
And so again, in this case, she worked with the parents first? Or was that not able to happen in this case?
No, we weren't able to do that. We weren't able to do that because in most cases there wasn't a parent, or there was only perhaps somebody who was occasionally there, a grandmother or something, who couldn't come to the school. But we got parental permission, and it seemed to work. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so fewer actual sessions, and then the tremoring itself, also 20 minutes, or a shorter period of time for kids?
Shorter period of time. Children stop tremoring after about 3 to 5 minutes. They just don't tremor for longer, unless they're teenagers. So under 12, it's a very different scenario. They tremor for a short period of time, and then they integrate for longer. So they fall asleep at the end of 3 minutes or 5 minutes, and they sleep for about an hour. Whereas adults integrate for 3 minutes at the end of their 20-minute session. So it's a complete the other way around, yeah.
Interesting.
And all of it.
So I can hear parents saying, this sounds too good to be true. and my kid will never do this, because if I ask him or her to do anything, all I get is opposition and defiance and you're not the boss of me, or worse. So how was it helpful then that the parents were not the ones teaching this, correct? And it was being done in the school?
Yes. You know, we moved from the school project to I then started teaching it within the Cape Town area to my TRE providers, who then started delivering it to their middle class homes where there were families with children who were stressed or had problems. And they found the same sort of thing. If the mother was delivering it or the father was delivering it, there was a lot of opposition on the basis of relationship issues, really, you know. They had very good results if they went in as a provider themselves and saw the child on their own, saw the mother on its own, and only later on, after a few weeks, when the child was accustomed to the whole exercise and actually found it was really lovely. Children love it once they've experienced it. They will come back for more once they've experienced it, and they will actually do it themselves without being asked. They use it for a tool for their own bodies for the rest of their lives. And so in the school, what used to happen was this teacher would come in the mornings, and at 7 o'clock there would be children lined up outside her classroom waiting to have another go, you know. Please, miss, can I lie on the floor and shake? I need it. So they came to ask for it. Yes.
Wow, that's really quite remarkable, because of course it's just it's always such a frustration, depending on the different therapies or modalities that we're trying to use, whether the children will cooperate or not, or whether you can't get them in the car to get to the therapist's office, or they'll just, you know, refuse to do what you ask. So let me ask you this though, because I've seen a few videos of this, and the posture, the pose you end up in when you're shaking is with your knees spread apart, right, on the floor. Is that too vulnerable a position for people who have had sexual trauma?
Yes.
Or have you run into that? Are there modifications for, say, that, or people who for various either emotional or physical reasons can't go through the traditional exercises?
Yeah, the position you end up with on the floor, and it's a necessary position for tremoring, sadly. It is the most successful way to tremor. But there are modifications, but in essence, I mean, part of what I train on the 3 days, I also train on all these variables. I train on sexual trauma and how to work with that. I train on how to work with teenagers. They are a different handful altogether, because teenagers can be quite, you know, they have a very supercharged nervous system, and they can have quite strong responses. So one has to learn to manage that. And so yes, that's all part of the training that I do. And there are ways in which we have to manage that differently. But first of all, just to say that for children, I give all children under the age of 12, all children, I give them a blanket. So we cover them up to their chests with a blanket, you know, and if they don't want it, they'll throw it off. But the majority of them like it and they hold on to it. And so you'll see in my videos, my training videos, all these little kiddies lying in long rows with blankets over themselves. And they feel much more secure, and it takes away that awkwardness about the position. And I do the same with the sexual abuse people. If too much shame is coming up on the floor, even under a blanket, then I will invite them just to tremor on the wall. And you can have a whole tremor session against the wall. It's not as comfortable, you know, or relaxing, but you can still tremor on the wall. And
so
that's
you might start there, and then perhaps
and
as you have released some.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the training that you have created, you are training folks who have already been certified in TRE, correct? So you're not training the basics of TRE. That's a separate process.
Yes.
And I think we were talking about this earlier. Right now, there is no training. Your training doesn't exist currently outside of South Africa, except for some trainings that you've done in Europe, correct?
Yeah, I started introducing this last year in Europe. I did a training in London with 56 TRE providers attending from all over Europe and Canada. I've not been invited to the States to do it, but I would imagine that the organization in the States would be getting on at some point to developing a training for children. But at the moment, I've not been involved with that. So I've got trainings this year happening in Europe again, Europe and Eastern Europe. And yeah, it's time really for other people to start delivering TRE for children. It's not difficult. It's just that I've had the experience, and I've got the research, and I've got video footage, which is always very powerful for people to see. And I've developed guidelines, but you know, it's all pretty straightforward. And we were talking earlier as well about the possibility of maybe training online. And I think that this would be an ideal thing for me to be able to train online, because it doesn't really require the practical side. You know, once you've trained as a TRE provider, you know how to do the exercise. What you're needing to learn is what are all the variables in children. And one of the biggest inputs of what I do is not just this is how you change the exercise. That's easy. I can put that in an email. But what people need to know is the developmental trauma. You've got to understand that before you work with a child. You cannot assume that children haven't had some kind of developmental trauma from the time of conception onwards.
Yeah, that's key. And I'm wondering, as I can hear parents thinking, or other practitioners who might like to refer their clients to somebody who knows how to do this, and then feeling discouraged that there's nobody here in the States. You're lucky if you live in South Africa, you're golden, right? But elsewhere across the world, that we might have difficulty finding people who are trained in this, specifically for children. And we've talked a little bit about the possibility of inviting you over to do some training, or maybe some trainer training, so that we can start spreading this more widely. What would be the best course, do you think, for parents who would like to advocate for that, to reach out to David Bercelli and the TRE, I can't remember what it's called, the main
TRE for All
Institute.
TFA. Yes, it's called TRE for All, the TFA.
Okay.
Do you have their website, traumaprevention.com?
Yeah. I was just trying to think of the name of the main organization, and whether it would be useful for parents to send emails and say, we need to bring Dr. Melanie here to the States, and we need to train people here or in Canada, or in South America, or elsewhere in Europe, to bring the specific training, because of course we have really an epidemic of trauma in our children. Certainly here in the States, but it's not exclusive here. We have far too many children on medication. And if we can get them young, and of course teach them some skills to regulate their nervous system throughout their lives, what a gift, not to mention the improvement in their lives, and immediately the lives of their families, their educational prospects, their relationship prospects, all of those things.
And the thing is, you see, the reason why I would strongly support any movement to get this to spread is that it's so simple, it's so easy to deliver once you know what you're doing, and it's so quick. For the child itself, it's an effortless, painless procedure with no medication, without meds. It's not long term, it's very quick, it's enjoyable, it's fun, and they're able to recalibrate their nervous system back to normal with the activity of that tremor mechanism restored for the rest of their lives. They will never put stress on their bodies ever again, because they've had that return to normal. And, in 6 weeks, I mean, really, I think that people should be taking this to children, whoever they are. It doesn't matter whether the child's had trauma or not, or is a problem child. All children should be doing this. It should be in schools. I've been standing on a soapbox saying this for a long time now. So in order for me to come over there, you just need to invite me. I need probably 2 days, 3. If you give me 3 days, I can also put in what I'm doing in Europe is 3 days. And I also add on the 3rd day, I talk about sexual abuse, gender violence, working with all those more complicated things using TRE, because there are differences and it's important to know about that.
Now, let me ask you this. So are TRE providers generally also social workers, therapists, psychologists, or can a sort of lay person become certified in TRE as well?
A lay person can become certified. There are as many lay people as there are professionals.
Okay. All right. So that's good to know as well. We're going to include some links for how people can find out more about the trainings that you're doing in Europe. But do you want to just let us know where and when, if you can recall, you'll be training in Europe?
All right. So I'm going to be in Barcelona in Spain in July. I'll send you the link for that. Do you need to have the dates?
I think that you had said earlier they were in July. Is that
6th to the 8th of July?
Okay. Okay.
Yes. That's Barcelona. That's in Spain. And that will be an international TRE for children training, and I'll be including sexual abuse. I have a half a day on working with medical diseases, things like fibromyalgia and all the medical problems that come from chronic stress and trauma. You can cure with TRE. People don't know that. So I also do a half a day on that. I mean, that's a subject in itself which is fascinating. You know, fibromyalgia at the present in the States, I happen to have a slide on this, 60% of people have had or do have fibromyalgia, which is a consequence of having had stress and trauma 30 years ago. So childhood trauma leads eventually to fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, all of these autoimmune disorders, which they can't find a reason for, are actually come from trauma in childhood.
So well, of course, the adverse childhood experiences studies, you know, show a clear direct link between trauma, stress in childhood, and later medical issues.
But the beauty is that TRE can actually, in a 3 to 6 month period, can actually cure people of their fibromyalgia. I've probably cured about 100 people now from fibromyalgia. I know this isn't part of our discussion here, but it's important for people to know that if you've had childhood trauma and you've got the physical consequences now, that if you get your autonomic nervous system back to balance, a lot of your symptoms are going to go.
Wow, I mean, that's fascinating. So that leads me to another question, or actually I'll pause because I think there was another training you're doing in Europe. And was it in Poland, as I recall?
5th to the 7th of October.
Okay. Okay. So we'll include links. If you are thinking you might, you were already a TRE practitioner and want to find out more about working with children, and you'd like either you're in Europe, you could easily get to those, or if you're not, you can take a trip across the pond. But I know we don't have too much more time, but I wanted to ask about some of these other interventions that are quite common. So in many cases, of course, we see that these children, they have leaky guts. They may have, they've got all sorts of digestive issues. They probably have brain inflammation, low-level inflammation of all sorts throughout their bodies. We're often advised to take them off gluten and dairy and sugar and food preservatives and dyes, and to take enormous numbers of transmitters. We may have done testing to find that they have, say, they're predisposed to methylation problems that suppress their ability to detoxify their bodies. All sorts of things. They may have neurotransmitter imbalances. We've got, just a range of that generally we're looking at. What's your view on, it sounds like you're saying that a lot of those things naturally resolve themselves once the nervous system is back in line.
Yeah.
And that then there's really no need to sort of continue this very laborious, often expensive, and challenging to implement, especially with kids who are defiant and belligerent and very controlling, hypervigilant, all those things that a lot of our kids are suffering from.
Yes. Look, it's not my specialty, all of the stuff to do with inflammatory disorders and gut disorders. In that sense, I know that it's a hugely growing area of expertise. And yes, of course, all those parameters are going to be abnormal if the child is functionally out of balance. What my experience of doing TRE with the most traumatized of children, the ones that society has actually given up on, doing TRE with them, they suddenly become normal kids again. And it's like, as a medical doctor, I would choose to do TRE first and then see what we're left over with, because a lot of these things are not permanent. They're not chronic in a child. A lot of these things are very eminently recoverable. So if you can get the nervous system balanced, then you might find that your gut inflammation, that leaky gut, all of that stuff settles down. I would certainly, it doesn't cost you anything. It's safe. It's enjoyable. It's quick. It makes sense to do that first. And it's a self-help tool for life.
And have you had any experience in applying TRE to children who have been diagnosed on the autism spectrum?
I personally haven't, but I do know a doctor in South Africa who has worked with a few older children in their teens with autism with very good results, really good results. They've calmed down, they've developed much more contact, the stress levels go down. The thing about TRE is that it reduces stress for whatever you might have. So there's always an improvement on that alone, on that level alone. It won't cure the autism, but it will certainly make it more manageable. I think that's more the approach. It's the same with epilepsy. At least a third of my little kiddies had epilepsy. They had fewer epileptic seizures because they now were de-stressed. So instead of having seizures 3 times a week, they were having 1 a month. So if you're calming the nervous system down, a lot of these other things calm down and improve.
Yeah, it's just remarkable. Well, in respect, and in another, it makes so much sense that it sort of seems like, of course, why wouldn't we have always thought that? So it's really quite something. We are just about out of time. I don't know if you have any final thoughts you'd like to share for parents or for practitioners who may be looking into this. I can also post a link to the main TRE website. They have a phenomenal provider list across the world. So if you're looking for somebody you'd like to work with initially, pardon me. But are there any final thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners, our viewers?
No, I think we've covered just about everything. I mean, I do want to say that I'm very open to discussion. If there are any TRE providers out there in America or any other therapists who want to discuss a little bit further with me or have questions for me, I'm very open to further discussion. I'd be very happy if anyone wants to email me. So by all means, you can give my email out. Obviously, might take a little while to reply if I get a lot of emails. But I'm very willing, I've always have been very willing to support people and to answer questions and to get engaged in discussion. I always see what I do as a work in progress. I don't see it as the final endpoint. And so I'm eager to learn and I'm eager to support others to help children. Basically.
That's great. So I will be happy to also share your email. So if folks want to reach out, and I will be personally continuing to see what we can do to bring you to the States to increase the number of folks that we have who have this background so that we can spread this work with children. So I want to thank you so much for joining me today and sharing this remarkable work with us. Gives me a lot of hope, which is a little hard to come by sometimes these days. So I thank you very much for joining us today. And I want to thank everyone out there for viewing this. And please help share the word about this remarkable therapy. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.